here because if I can't be flying, I like to be talking about it. And over 40 years ago, a group of women pilots banded together to preserve the history of women in aviation and space. The idea of a museum to collect and exhibit the memorabilia of the early women pilots took flight, and in 1976, the International Women's Air and Space Museum was incorporated in Dayton, Ohio. The first museum was opened in Centerville, Ohio, in the former home of the great-uncle of the Wright brothers. The house was built in 1806, and by 1998, it needed major repairs. That's the year we moved to Burke Lakefront Airport, our present home, in the terminal building and in Cleveland. And you can see the terminal building. There's the runway is down at the lower left corner, and just close to that is the terminal building. You can see the two-story section, and then the west concourse. That's where our museum is. It's free, open to the public whenever the museum is open, or whenever the terminal building is open. So come on down. We're the only free museum in Museum Row. Okay, women were involved in aeronautics as early as the 18th century. Madame Elizabeth Thibault was the first female aeronaut to make an untethered ascent as a passenger in a hot air balloon in France in 1784. The first woman aeronaut in her own right was Madeline Sophie Blanchard. She made her first ascent in 1805, and she gained such a reputation for her ballooning exploits that Napoleon made her the official aeronaut of the empire, and he asked her to perform at his wedding in her balloon, and she did. The first woman to pilot a powered aircraft solo was Aida D'Acosta. In 1903, 5 months before the Wright brothers flew a heavier-than aircraft, she flew over Paris in a Santos Dumont lighter-than airship. Catherine Wright was not a pilot, but she was so helpful to her brothers that General Long referred to her as the third member of the team. She is here readying herself for a flight in one of the Wright brothers' Wright flyers, and Wilbur is at the controls, and Orville is standing by here. Catherine's exhibit at the museum was our first one, and here's Catherine. She's a very short lady, and she is talking to General Long in that picture. And here's the artist's rendition of our first exhibit. When we moved to Burke Lakefront, the stairway and the escalator is in the background, the slant, and that was a hazard to the handicapped. So we filled in that space with our exhibit and helped the airport comply with the ADA. And this is the actual exhibit. It looks much like the artist's drawing, and the people at the Port Authority said that was one of the first times that something that was submitted was actually what happened. Usually it's not like that, I guess. Anyway, this is the white lace dress that Catherine wore to the White House in 1909 to meet President Taft. And she wore that dress, so it's over 100 years old, and it's very fragile. But she was such a small girl that we had a lot of mannequins that didn't fit it. They were too large. So a dressmaker in Springfield, Ohio, who was a pilot, gave us her model and her dress, the thing that she used to make her own clothes. So she gave that to us, and we're glad because we didn't want to have a head on it anyway. There are a lot of artifacts in the case and pictures that were given to us by the Wright family when we were in Centerville. And when we moved to Cleveland, they said we could keep all these things as part of our permanent exhibit because there is a connection, Northeastern Ohio connection with Catherine. She was a graduate of Oberlin College and ended up as a board member of Oberlin. So she's there. And as an aside, there were 5 children in Bishop Wright's family. The boys, 4 boys and a girl. Guess which one was the only one to go to college? It was, of course, Catherine. There she is in the dress at the White House, and President Taft is in the middle, and Wilbur and Orville are on either side. This is Baroness Raymond de la Roche. She's about to make her first flight in 1909. She was the first woman to be issued a pilot's license. This is Blanche Stewart Scott. She was called the tomboy of the air, and she had Glenn Curtis as her instructor, and he disapproved of women flying. So he put a throttle block on her airplane so she could not go into the air. He said, just taxi, don't try to fly. And on September 2nd, 1910, in spite of the block, she soared 10 feet into the air to become the first American woman to make even a short solo flight. This is Harriet Pluming. She was the first American woman to obtain a pilot's license. A year later, she was the first woman to fly solo over the English Channel. That was April 1912, the same day that the Titanic struck the iceberg. That's why nobody knows about Harriet, and everybody knows about the Titanic. She designed her own flying costume in her favorite color, purple satin. And we have a replica of her suit. This is how she looked with the purple, and the airplane that she flew is in the background. And these are the famous Stinson sisters, Marjorie and Catherine Stinson. They were early aviation's best-known sisters. They and their mother opened the Stinson Flying School in Texas in 1915, and they taught young men who became the combat pilots of World War I. Ruth Law set many world altitude records in the early years, and she performed 3 loops over the Statue of Liberty in 1916 when it was first lighted at night. This is Bessie Coleman. There were very few early black women pilots. They were discriminated against because of their color and their race. Bessie Coleman was born in Texas, grew up in Chicago, and wanted to learn to fly. Nobody would teach her. So she learned French, went to France, learned to fly, came back to the United States, and did aerial demonstrations. She was the first African American to earn an international pilot's license and the first black woman in the world to fly an airplane. And of course, Amelia Earhart, everyone knows that name. She had lit the way for many other women pilots, and she encouraged women to compete and excel in any field that interested them. On May 20th, 1932, she was the first woman to fly the Atlantic solo. And she flew a Lockheed 10E in July 1937 on her ill-fated around-the-world flight. She disappeared before her scheduled landing on tiny Howland Island in the Pacific, and what happened to her is still a mystery. You know, they're still looking for her, and you probably read that they found some pieces of aluminum that they think might have come from her airplane. The organization that goes to do that is called TIGHAR, the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery. And their leader is Rick Gillespie. He came to our museum and gave a talk. We do a lot of programs up there at Burke Lakefront, and so if you go to our website, you'll find out. I have some cards that I'll pass around later, but if you go on our website, you'll find out some of these things. And he spoke about the searches. He's gone on 9 or 10 of them now. And when we knew he was coming, we got all of our things out that we have of Amelia's and put them on display. We have one of her flight suits. It's very, very fragile, so we don't have it out all the time. We did bring it out. And we also had what we thought was a lock of her hair. And he said, may I have a couple of strands of that hair so that I can test it for DNA in case we find anything that belonged to Amelia in our search, we can prove that it really was her. And we said yes, because we had gotten that from the Smithsonian, who received it from a maid in the White House who got it out of a wastebasket in the room where Amelia stayed. So we were pretty sure that that would be okay. And when he had it tested, we found out it was just thread. But it made the national news. So he's still looking. And he's either just going or has just returned from another search. Anyway, there have been many books written about her, which we have at the museum. And personally, I hope they never find her, because people will stop talking and stop looking. This is the first cross-country race for women. It was flown in 1929. It started at Santa Monica, California, and ended in Cleveland, Ohio. And Amelia was in the race. She's the one in the dark jacket. And next to her in the dark hair, the tall one, is Louise Thaden. She was the winner of the race, and Amelia came in third. But they all came to Cleveland, and they decided that the women ought to organize. They ought to form a group. So they sent letters to 117 licensed women pilots of the day. 99 of them responded and said they would like to form a club. So they decided to call themselves the 99s. They still call them the 99s today, but there are about 5,000 members. And I'm a 99. So Cleveland has always been in the forefront of aviation history. And this is Blanche Noyes. She is one of Ohio's first licensed women pilots. She was a stage actress before she learned to fly. And she flew the forerunner of the helicopter called the Pitcairn Autogyro for Standard Oil of Ohio, because she was married to Dewey Noyes, who was chief pilot for Standard Oil of Ohio. And I met Blanche when she was here, because she was also the director of air marking for the FAA in Washington, and she came to Cleveland on a visit, and I was able to meet her. And another of Amelia's contemporaries was Ruth Nichols. She held the women's records for altitude, distance, and speed, all in 1931. She is wearing a fur flying suit because in 1931 they didn't have nice lightweight textiles to keep you warm like we have today. She went, her altitude record was almost 29,000 feet. And there she is, sitting on her Lockheed Vega. She named it the Akita. And we have the tail of that aircraft in our collection. Here it is. It was on display when we were in Centerville because we could lock the door and nobody could bother our things. But we can't put it on display at Brooke because we don't have a case big enough. It's pretty big. It is in our storeroom, and if you insist, we will take you there to show it to you. And this is Burl Markham. She was the first woman to solo across the Atlantic from east to west. And she was born in England, grew up in Kenya, and her extraordinary life is described in the book West with the Night. Perhaps some of you have read that. This is Anne Morrow Lindbergh. She was a pilot, author, and adventuress, and she went on many important flights with her husband, Charles. When World War II broke out, the women in England formed the Air Transport Auxiliary, or the ATA. They ferried aircraft from the factories to the airfields, everything from small planes to heavy four-engine bombers. After the war, the group was disbanded and largely forgotten. After the United States entered the war, the WAFs, the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron was formed in 1942 by veteran pilot Nancy Love. That's Nancy. She and Betty Gillies were just two of the WAFs who flew the B-17. And there's Betty Gillies, the little one. Betty was 5 feet 1.5 inches tall and had to have cushions behind and under her to reach the controls and wooden blocks so she could reach the rudder pedals. The WAFs ferried every kind of airplane flown by the military throughout the United States, but were never allowed to ferry aircraft overseas. Jacqueline Cochran, a pilot with many speed records to her credit and a powerful woman who owned her own cosmetics firm, convinced General Hap Arnold to commission a women's military flight center to aid in the war effort. In 1943, her group merged with the WAFs, and the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, or the WASP, was formed. I have to tell you a little about Jackie Cochran. When she was 8 years old, she received her first pair of shoes. She came from a very, very poor background, but she was a very ambitious person. And by the time she was 22, she owned her own cosmetics firm. And there she is in her WASP uniform. In 1943 and 1944, a total of 1,074 WASP learned to fly the Army way. Over 10,000 of them applied, but only 1,074 made the grade. The only difference in their training was that the male cadets received more aerobatic training because they were going to be flying combat. And the women received more cross-country training because they had to ferry airplanes long distances. They ferried them and they took passengers, and they also tested them, and they flew and got shot at with live ammunition. And here they are at Sweetwater, Texas, where they all learned to fly. And they're in the, it was a tradition to throw coins into the wishing well. They're all dressed up in their dress uniforms. Mostly they wore coveralls that were very baggy because they weren't made for women. 3 squadrons of Russian pilots, known as the Night Witches, were the only women to actually fly combat in World War II. The Russian women earned the name Night Witches from the Germans, who heard them flying, buzzing overhead just before the bombs fell. And this is Natalia Mecklin. She flew a tiny biplane night bomber as a member of the 388th Regiment. After the war, Jackie Cochran continued to add to her many records, this time flying jets. One of her biggest boosters was famous test pilot Chuck Yeager. In 1953, Jackie was the first woman to break the sound barrier in a jet. And when she died, she had more records than any other pilot, male or female. And this is Louise Saki. She logged over 300 transoceanic trips to South Africa, the Philippines, and Europe, ferrying single and twin-engine airplanes from the factories to the buyer all over the world. And right off the assembly line, which is very brave because she was actually flight testing them as she went. She founded her own ferry company, SAFE, Saki Air Ferry Enterprises. And she's standing in front of a map in her apartment. She passed away about 10 or 12 years ago, and the Philadelphia 99s took that map off the wall, encased it in plastic, and gave it to the museum. We have it encased in glass to protect it further, but it's just like that. And Louise was a very frugal person, so she put her routes on the map with rickrack and thumbtacks, and that's the way it is. And it's very dark because she was a heavy smoker. That always bothered me because to fly long flights and not smoke would be difficult, but she had ferry tanks in the cabin, in the fuselage, with her on these flights. And we do have her cigarette lighter in our collection. We have a lot of her artifacts. They're not all on display, but many of her awards are on display in the West Concourse. And this is Robin Miller. She was a nurse and a pilot from Australia, and she was known to the Aboriginal children as the Sugar Bird Lady. Now, some of you know what that means. She helped vaccinate the population of the Northwest Australia children against the polio in the mid-1960s. And they remember, you older people will remember that we used to put the vaccine on sugar cubes and give it to the children. And after the war, there weren't many things for women to do, so they started doing women-only air racing and flying in races such as the all-women coast-to-coast powder puff derby. This is a team. The tall one is Bea Stedman. She was president of the museum before I became president. The short one is Joan Rubeck, who was our director for many years in Centerville and then again in Burke. She helped me bring the museum to Cleveland. They always dressed alike in pairs because when you were all out looking, getting ready to go or having something to eat and then getting ready to go, and you lost your partner, you could say, "Where's my co-pilot?" and they'd know what to look for. It was the same dress. We always wore dresses, and Joan told me that when they were coming in one time, they always took their skirt off because they didn't want to wrinkle it. When you race, you close the vents on the airplane so that you can go faster. It slows the airplane down if the vents are open. And so they took their skirts off. And they landed, and they quickly put their skirts on to get out. They put each other's skirts on. And you can imagine what they looked like when they got out, with Bea in the short skirt and Joni with one almost to the floor. So they had to get back in the airplane and switch skirts. She always thought that was a funny thing. And here's another couple. This is in 1970, and the one on your left is me. The one on the right is Pat Collier, my co-pilot, on 14 races. I was expecting my daughter. The race was in July. Kathy was born in September, and we are wearing matching maternity outfits. Now, that's what I call loyalty. Pat said she liked the dresses afterwards because they were great to mow the lawn in. They were nice. We didn't win a prize, but we sure had a lot of fun. And this is Judith Ann Newford of Worcester, Ohio. She was the first woman to fly solo in a Navy aircraft in 1973, and she's the daughter of a World War II fighter pilot. And then there's space. In June 1963, Russian cosmonaut Valentina Tereshkova was the first woman in space when she orbited the Earth 48 times in the Russian spaceship Vostok 6. Now, you know that Congress didn't want women to fly in space. That's why the Russians had the first 2 women in space. The third woman in space was Sally Ride, but it took 20 years. It wasn't until June 1984 that she was allowed to go into space. Many more have followed, and more are accepted each year, and there's one getting ready to go. In fact, 2 are getting ready to go right now, but they have to go in to the space station in a Russian shuttle, because ours aren't ready yet, the new ones. This is our space exhibit, and we have run out of room. The lower row is full, and we have about 12 or 13 on an easel. We are going to raise money to redo the exhibit so that we can get them all on one wall, and hopefully, in the course, they'll be smaller. But you see, we have a notebook affair on the lower left that tells the biographies of all of these women, so that young people can come and see what it takes to become an astronaut, because they're not all pilots. Some are scientists, doctors, all sorts of different occupations, because there are so many things to do in the space shuttle or on the space station that doesn't require a pilot. Jerry Cobb was one of the first of the Mercury 13. They were the women who passed all the tests for astronaut training in the 1960s. We call them the flats, the First Lady astronaut trainees. There were 13 of them who passed all the tests. And Jerry Cobb is still trying to go into space. She is a missionary pilot down in South America, and she's still active today. But she thinks because John Glenn got to go when he was in his 70s that she ought to be able to go too. And I doubt if they'll ever let her go. But this is her in one of those gimbal rigs in which they tested your equilibrium. And they did pass all the tests in the 60s. We had a reunion for them because they were all tested individually. We had a reunion for them in Centerville, and that was the first time they all got together at one time. So it was kind of interesting to hear their stories. And here are some of them. They were invited to see Eileen Collins when she was the first woman to command a space shuttle. They were invited to go out down to see her take off. And you can see Bee Stedman, who was the Powder Puff Derby pilot. She's on the extreme right, and she was also one of them, Mercury 13. And the little one next to her is Myrtle Cagle. When we had our exhibit constructed at Burke to memorialize these Mercury 13, we asked each of them to send us something to remember them. They all had careers in aviation, although they didn't get to go into space, but they all, so we got trophies and we got all sorts of memorabilia. But Myrtle Cagle brought us her wedding dress. She was engaged to a World War II fighter pilot, and she made her dress out of a parachute. Unfortunately, he was killed before they were married. She never wore that dress. She later married another man. They had a daughter. The daughter brought her and the dress to the museum, and we have it. We had it on display for a while. We took it down, and we'll be putting it back again because it's a good story. She is still alive and a very nice lady. And this is Connie Wolf. She was a balloonist, and she had set records as well, with altitude, duration, and distance records for women in 1961 and 62. She has a big balloon that is shaped, or she's passed away, but she had a balloon that was shaped like the Liberty Bell, and she could take it to other countries and give balloon demonstrations. Today there are probably 3,000 women who fly for the airlines, and they're organized into the International Society of Women Airline Pilots. Have any of you ever taken a flight on an airliner that had a woman pilot? They're not bad, are they? They're just as good as men. I once heard a lady mayor say, women must do things twice as well as men in order to be successful. And then she added, luckily this is not difficult. And there are even all-women crews in the United States Air Force. And this is Margaret Rittenberg. She was a flight instructor with over 40,000 hours, who flew many races, including one around the world when she was 82 years old. Tom Brokaw wrote a whole chapter about her in his book, The Greatest Generation. Have any of you read that? You might have read about Margaret. She's standing in front of a Cherokee 180, which is the kind of airplane that I fly. She had a remarkable career. She was one of our board members at the museum, and she was asked to speak at Oshkosh one year about 4 or 5 years ago. She drove up to Oshkosh and they were waiting for her to come down to breakfast that morning. And she hadn't given her talk yet, but they went up and found that she had passed away in her sleep. And I said, way to go, Margaret. And of course, we do have some of her artifacts as well. And this is Tracy Pillars. She was a divorced mother of 6 children who built her own aircraft in her garage. She had a pilot's license, and she became a mechanic as well. And she built and test flew her own airplane called a Smith mini plane. She won a women's aerobatic championship in it in 1965. She called it her pretty purple putty tack, and it has a mink-covered control stick. She was also a writer and an artist, and we have examples of her work in our museum. That cat that's sitting on the wing was purple. We have the cat. However, it is faded red right now. We have the airplane. It is on display in the West Concourse. She was suffering from cancer when we moved to Cleveland. She knew that it was going to be on display, and we sent her pictures. We opened the last of August in 1999, and she passed away in October. But she knew it was on exhibit, and she was very pleased. There it is. It was in the lobby, not the West Concourse, but we had to move it because they put a flight school right there in the glass enclosed office. But you can see it's a little, you can see it's purple, the stripes. And then in the background is Harriet Quimby's flying suit on display. And I have to tell you that Harriet Quimby's flying suit the original had 52 buttons because they didn't have zippers and Velcro. We do, so that's what we used in our replica. And then there's Nancy Tier, who was the first woman colonel in the Civil Air Patrol. And she flew a tiny plane over the coast of New England during World War II looking for U-boats. She didn't have anything to attack them with, but she could radio back and tell the people on the ground what the location was. There are a couple of other people I want to mention. Jerry Mauck, who flew solo around the world in 1964, was a Columbus housewife. She had less than 700 hours when she did it. And I had a lady who was at the Cleveland Air Show last year as an aerobatic pilot, Julie Clark. She stood there and she said, I can't believe it. That is absolutely amazing. And yet she is amazing herself. So there's a mutual admiration among women pilots. Then Marge Robur, who was a local woman, was a WASP. She was an English teacher at Harvey High School. And she set a record in Miami in 1947, a speed record for women. We have her trophy on display at the moment. And her family, I know them, they gave her scrapbooks and her trophies and much memorabilia, including a dress that we saw in some of her photographs. And the plane that she used was named the City of Painesville. And the lady who brought some of her mother's artifacts brought a picture of that airplane with Marge in it tonight. It's a little
I
bitty
didn't
one.
know who that was. I had no
Oh,
idea.
gosh.
This
That-
is new to me.
Oh, I was just so thrilled to see it. So
Wow.
if you want to see it,
Mom must have known, but I...
yeah, Bob knew and I knew, because I have a bigger picture of it at the museum.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's been an exciting evening for me, and I hope you've enjoyed the program. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.